One of the things in CQRS you have and event sourcing you have is the use of domain-driven design. And domain-driven design requires something called aggregate roots. And the theory behind aggregate roots is every aggregate root is a island to itself. So every aggregate root is isolated. There's no relationships that you have in SQL tables. In SQL tables you would have this kind of like relationships like that, but with aggregate roots that doesn't exist. Now, an aggregate root can know, draw this line differently, it can know that something else exists if it has the ID of the other aggregate root, which is typically a GUID. So it can say, hey, I know who that is, but it's not going to have like a reference to it. And if that other object disappears, there's no referential integrity like you get in SQL. And this is because we're following in these architectures you also have eventual consistency. And that means that what you see at a particular point in time is not necessarily is not exactly what the user intended. What the user intended, you might have commands in the queue, and those commands in the queue at a later time might only be visible in the system. They might not be available at this particular moment because you're processing load. Okay, so one of the problems is how to prevent duplicate ARs, aggregate roots. And this is, let's say you have a command, let's say you have two commands in the queue. This is the queue, this is the command queue. And let's say one of these commands is create employee. Let's see, the other one is create employee. And in my business requirement, I have projects, employees, and I'm going to have multiple projects, and I'm going to have employees involved in multiple projects. And the employee has its own sphere of business logic and things. So I have employees and projects as an aggregate root. So I have projects who know about employees. They can't actually prove the employee's there, but they know he's there. They know he should be there at this GUID. So my question then is, given I've got two commands, let's say this has happened through an error in the UI, or sometimes in commands you get, in buses and things, you get duplicate messages. So let's say both of these commands both have, let's say you want to create an employee called Bob. And let's say, like, how do you know if it's unique or not? What's your unique index? Well, of course, we're going to have GUIDs here. GUIDs are the unique index here. But how are you going to identify this employee? I mean, you don't want to have duplicate employees. So email is a good one for me. I'm going to go Bob at msn.com. Nice and short. And of course, this one's also going to be Bob at msn.com. So these are duplicates, right? So what we don't want to have is we don't want to have two different command handlers. Let's say let's say two workers come along. We don't want to have worker one. We don't want to have worker one go and get this off the queue. We don't want to have worker one get this off the queue and then start working, and then worker two get this off the queue and then start working, and all of a sudden now we're going to commit two different aggregate roots. We don't want to have that. That's bad. So how can we prevent that? Well, there's numerous ways to do this, but to keep this video short, I'd like to focus on the idea that I have, and this is what I'll be exploring. In your command handler, let's see, there is a process by which you take in an 'i' repository, and the repository will load the aggregate root. Repository. And what you're going to do is you're going to say root equals, let's say this is the repository you're going to use, equals repository dot get. Oh, hang on. Well, we're in the create mode, right? I'm getting too far ahead of myself. So we know at some point we're going to go like this. We're going to go. I'm going to use a different tool. We're going to say var new root equals static method here, employee dot create, and given a command for shortness of this, I'm just going to go put the command right in there. So there's your new root, and then you're going to want to save it, right? So you're going to go rep dot save new root. And the question is, how at this point do you know that you're going to prevent duplicates? And what I'd like to suggest is we get what's called another aggregate. And this aggregate is called get by. Okay, so we're going to have a company ID, and the company ID is going to be in the command. We'll know what company we're talking about. I'm dealing with multi-tenancy here. So I'm going to have a company ID, so I know who the tenant is, and I'm going to have an email. Those are the only things I really care about. And before I do this, what I want to do is I want to call another aggregate. And I'm going to get what's called, I'm going to go my repository, get of type, it's my employee Rolodex. I'm going to pass in my company ID, and I'm going to have let's see, var er equals. So then I can go er, and I can go add employee, and I can pass in the email. And this is interesting now. Now what I'm able to do is now I can go repository dot save. Oh, and what I should also do at this point in time, it's not good enough. Not good enough. I'm going to also pass in the aggregate root new. It's called employee GUID. That's the GUID for the aggregate root. I'm going to pass that in as well. So I'm going to say if there's any Rolodex, associate this email with this employee GUID. And this is good now. Now what we can do is we can excuse me. Oops. Now what we can do is we can save that employee Rolodex. And excuse me. In more complex business processes, this would be the case where you use the Saga. And you'd have a long-going process to handle things. But this is only just preventing duplicates. So in this case, what you could then do is, here's where you would insert call to employee. So, excuse me, this right here, this is where you would perform this stuff. You would perform this right here. So you'd say, I'm going to make my employee aggregate. I'm going to, then you would go rep dot save employee. Now, there are no transactions here. We're eventually consistent. So there is the potential there is the potential for this to succeed and this to fail. So that is still a problem. That scenario, you will still have to solve somehow. I'm not going to include that in this video. But what you do solve is you solve this other scenario where you would have two queues. Because, and I'm using Jonathan Oliver's event store library, because this call here, the first handler would save that, and by the time the second handler got there and wanted to also save that, you get a concurrency exception because the Rolodex has already been updated. So you would save the duplicate problem. The only problem you would still have again is if for some whatever reason, through a network problem or something, if this call failed down here, then you would somehow have to possibly, some solutions might be to reuse this GUID somehow, or you would somehow detect if this GUID is missing in aggregate roots. I don't know. But anyway, thanks for watching. That's all.